So good afternoon again. I'm Mary Howard, President of the Science and Engineering Council of Santa Barbara and board member at this point. Very much our sponsors, Community West Bank, Bengal Engineering, Toyon, no. I also like to welcome our new members, Douglas Mueller, Martin Tanner, John West. Welcome, CC. And to say thank you to all of those who made donations this month, both to the Science and Engineering Council and to our STEM by way of the Scholarship Foundation of Santa Barbara. I'd like to ask the other board members that are here today, in addition to our program chair, Yvonne DeGraw, whom we will be hearing from shortly. Bob Lilly, I believe, is here. John Fishpaw, Joseph Strongs, Tim Murphy, our current president, will be joining us later, as will Stephen Stopak, our secretary. So, Yvonne, would you like to introduce our speaker for today?
Sure, thanks, Mary. Let's see. So today, I just wanted to go over some of our upcoming meetings first. Our next meeting will actually be March 30th. That's an off-cycle meeting on Zoom, and we'll be presenting awards to the Best in Division and Best in Show winners of the Santa Barbara County Science Fair. They'll be presenting their projects, which serves as practice for them for this state science fair, which takes place in April before our April meeting. And we do have a full slate of upcoming talks scheduled through August. And so hopefully we'll be able to return to in-person luncheons sometime soon, but until then we'll be on Zoom. On April 13th, we have Dr. Michael Mahon from UCSB Biology Department. He'll be speaking on smartphone spit tests for COVID and influenza. On May 11th, we have Dr. Kenneth Kozik, co-director of UCSB's Neuroscience Research Institute. He'll be speaking on the surprising science of brain organoids. On June 8th, we have Dr. Rachel Street from the Las Cumbres Observatory. She'll be speaking on hunting isolated black holes with microlensing and some exciting black hole discoveries that they have contributed to recently. On July 13th, we have Dr. Galen Moody from UCSB's Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. He'll be speaking on quantum computing and quantum photonics. And on August 10th, Dr. Christopher Richardson from UCSB Biology will speak on DNA damage repair. Today, we're very happy to have Dr. Christopher Free as our speaker. Dr. Free is a quantitative ecologist in the research faculty at UCSB's Bren School of Environmental Science and Management. His research is focused on understanding the impacts of climate change on ocean fisheries and on developing fisheries management strategies that mitigate the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and human livelihoods. His publications include papers in Nature, Science, and the Journal of Applied Ecology. He has a BA in Conservation Biology from Middlebury College and a PhD in Oceanography from Rutgers. During his talk, you can post questions in the Zoom chat or ask them out loud after Dr. Free's talk. So Dr. Free, go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing.
Awesome.
And
Thanks
there
so
you
much.
go.
Awesome. Perfect. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Yvonne, for that introduction and for the invitation to come and talk with you all today. And thanks all of you for attending. It's great to see so many faces out there, especially when there wasn't a lunch to lure you in. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about a topic that's sort of near and dear to me, which is trying to understand the impacts of climate change on ocean fisheries and aquaculture, and also understanding the opportunities for mitigating those impacts and increasing sort of livelihoods and food and nutrition production from the ocean despite climate change. So I hope that this talk sort of contains elements of optimism. I think it's not going to be your sort of like classical sort of doom and gloom portrayal of climate change impacts. We are going to talk about negative impacts, but we're also going to talk about the sort of opportunities for human society to rise above those impacts. And I'm not going to get to the sort of Dungeness crab portion of the talk today that I listed in the abstract, but I'm happy to answer any questions about Dungeness crab in the questions. So to begin, I just want to sort of demonstrate the importance of ocean fisheries and aquaculture to supporting livelihoods and food and nutrition to people all around the world, and start right here in our hometown. So if you've been down to the harbor in Santa Barbara, you've probably seen our sort of vibrant fishing fleet in action. In the harbor, we have 60 to 80 fishing vessels landing fish there. And these support sort of 200 families that are actively involved in commercial fishing. And every year, those boats bring in 6 to 10 million pounds of seafood and $30 million to our local economy. And this is just in Santa Barbara. As we look across California, we see that California fisheries support more jobs than any other sort of state fishery in the US besides Florida, which has really, really large recreational fisheries. So Florida fisheries support about 173,000 jobs, and California fisheries support 142,000 jobs. And then looking outside the US, marine ecosystems and fisheries are really important for a number of reasons, not just supporting livelihoods, but also presenting really critical sources of food and nutrition, and also sort of coastal protection services across the developing tropics. But these fisheries are really sort of threatened by climate change. Oh, sorry about that. Understanding the risk that is posed to fisheries by climate change is really critical to also understanding how we can adapt our management to be more resilient to those impacts. So this graph right here is just showing how sea surface temperature has changed over the last 50 years or so. So you've seen gradual warming since the 1950s, with more dramatic sort of warming occurring from the 1970s to today. And then you see how the ocean temperature is projected to increase under sort of two alternative greenhouse gas emissions scenario. This really severe one you might think of as a business as usual scenario, and this less severe scenario might be is sort of consistent with aggressive greenhouse gas emissions, sort of consistent with the Paris Accords. So under either one of these sort of potential futures, we do see rising sea surface temperature that wild populations of fish, farmed populations of fish, and fisheries managers will have to contend with. And so I wanted to mention really quickly that the sort of truth of what will probably happen falls probably someplace in between these two scenarios. So in the talk today, I want to sort of focus on the evidence that quite a bit of warming has already happened, and that presents the opportunity to learn what impacts of ocean warming have been on fisheries already, to help us build sort of intuition about what they're likely to be on the future. So the past really presents this opportunity to help us prepare for the future. So I'm going to divide the talk into sort of two parts, where I'm going to talk about evidence for climate change impacts on fisheries from the past, projected impacts in the future, and then our opportunities to mitigate those impacts. So to begin with, I wanted to sort of set up some intuition about why warming temperatures could be problematic for fish and shellfish, and sort of create problems that we need to react to. And this is illustrating like an example, what we call like thermal performance curve, where at some low temperature, an organism will not be able to sort of perform very well. At some very high temperature, organism will not be able to perform very well. And then someplace in between is the optimal temperature for performance for that organism. And this is a very wide thermal tolerance, 0 degrees to 100 degrees. And this might sort of, represent me when I lived in New Jersey before I came to Santa Barbara. When I could tolerate really wide temperatures. I could go skiing in the winter without gloves or a jacket. But a sort of different thermal curve, maybe sort of me once I moved to temperate Mediterranean Santa Barbara, can no longer tolerate those high or low temperatures, have to wear gloves when I go running. That thermal tolerance curve might look something like this. So a bit narrower and a sort of steeper drop off between the optimum temperature and the maximum temperature that I can tolerate. So every organism out in the ocean has its own thermal temperature tolerance sort of profile. And the shape of that profile really matters for how those organisms are likely to react to climate change. So for Santa Barbara Chris, with a really narrow temperature range, or so for New Jersey Chris, oh, sorry about that, with a wide temperature range, a degree or two of warming might not be as risky as for Santa Barbara Chris, where a degree or two of warming could push me towards my sort of critical maximum temperature more quickly. So when confronting sort of increasing temperatures, sorry, the animations are lagging a bit. When confronting these increasing temperatures in the ocean, sort of fish have a couple of sort of strategies for adapting to those changes. So if the temperature is within their thermal tolerance, they can sort of go about their business as usual. If temperatures are sort of fluctuate, but they can find their optimal temperatures, like in deeper waters or shallower waters, or more northern or more southern waters, they can modify their behavior a little bit to adapt. A more sort of extreme example of this is as temperatures warm, they might need to sort of move and relocate entirely away from their sort of normal native range to find their preferred temperatures. They also can exhibit some plasticity, where they're able to sort of alter their temperature tolerance a little bit. And at the most extreme end of the spectrum, they may sort of evolve an entirely new temperature tolerance. But all of these different options can be really sort of metabolically expensive and demanding for fish. So this can lead to sort of reduced performance, higher rates of mortality, lower growth rates, less reproduction, and ultimately could lead to sort of local extinction, or maybe extinction across the world's oceans. And so we've seen a lot of evidence for these types of changes already happening. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit. And this is even complicated further by the fact that each of these individual species is nested within a larger community of organisms, of prey species, of predator species, of competitors, and changes in the in the populations of one species have impacts throughout the entire food web. And layered on top of that is the sort of fishing industry that relies on these resources. So it's climate impacts can be very complex, is the point here. So I wanted to go through sort of some examples of how climate change has already impacted fisheries around the world. And one thing that we've already seen is that fish are on the move. They're moving to track their preferred temperatures. So in this map of the US, each one of these dots represents a population of a single fish species, and its arrow represents how it's changed. The center of that population has shifted over the last 60 years that we've been monitoring these species using scientific trawl surveys. And the big arrows sort of show in each one of these different regions of our continental shelf how all those fish have changed on average. The scientists that performed the study showed that these shifts in where populations are located are very well correlated with shifts in the temperature preferences of those fish species. So here you see that that the species are shifting in sort of the same direction, in the same magnitude as their temperature preference is shifting. So they're tracking their preferred temperatures out in the ocean. This has generally resulted in sort of poleward shifts to find cooler water, or in shifts into deeper water to find cooler water. And this has impacts on the fishing fleets that target these fisheries. So this is showing how large fishing vessels out of two ports, one port in Beaufort, North Carolina, and one port in Portland, Maine, have shifted their fishing grounds over time to track moving fish. And this is really interesting because it it highlights how different fleets and might be impacted differently. So down in Beaufort, these vessels are more specialized. So they have to track the fish species that they are specialized in targeting northward as they shift. In Portland, Maine, the vessels target a whole diversity of species, and they're able to sort of maintain their rough position by just sort of targeting different species in good years versus bad years. And unfortunately, smaller vessels down in nearby Englehart, North Carolina, don't have the same flexibility because they're they have less sort of capital to be able to spend all that money on gas to travel north, or less capital to sort of relocate themselves and their families further north. So they're not able to track those shifting fish resources quite as well. Another way that climate change impacts fisheries is through alterations to fish body size. So as the temperature goes up in the water, the dissolved oxygen content, the ability of the water to sort of retain oxygen, goes down. And because larger fish require more oxygen than smaller fish, this tends to favor smaller body sizes. So we've seen sort of consistent with increased water temperatures and decreased dissolved oxygen content, we've seen fish body sizes actually decline over time, which another impact of warming on fisheries. And then another really interesting example, and I'm gonna borrow this example from the sort of terrestrial world because I really like this graphic, is that climate change can often result in mismatches in food availability and the timing of different life history processes, which we call phonology. So to illustrate this, this graph is just showing sort of the biomass of caterpillars, which, oh, sorry about that, caterpillars which are prey to birds at a certain time of the year. And you see, they hatch in maybe early May and they peak end of May, and then they become less abundant towards June. And the birds that prey on these caterpillars have evolved so that that they lay eggs at a specific time, so that those eggs hatch right when peak biomass of caterpillars is occurring. And this allows for the highest rates of survival from eggs to fledglings. But if these two, if the timing of the caterpillar hatching is cued by a different environmental trigger than the timing of the egg laying for birds, this can result in mismatches where, in this case, caterpillar biomass has hatched earlier and is no longer available when the birds need it the most. And this can have really detrimental impacts on bird populations and also on fish populations. So a scientist did a big review of evidence for changing phonology, so changing timing of important life history events in marine ecosystems. And each one of these bars represents the amount of days per decade an event has shifted earlier or later. And the ones that are shown in black, that was inconsistent with the change in temperature. But for all the other ones, that shift in decade lined up with the change in temperature. So just highlighting that warming can result in these shifts in phenology that can result in mismatches in food availability and negative impacts on populations. So at this point, I hope I've sort of convinced you that fisheries are a crucial source of food and income to people all around the world. That the ocean has already warmed considerably, and that this warming has driven changes in the distribution and life history of fish. But a big sort of unanswered question at this point is what is the net impact of all of these changes been on seafood production? And this is a question that really interested me during my dissertation. So we looked at how ocean warming has impacted the amount of catch that fisheries from around the world can sustainably produce every year. And we looked at 235 populations of fish from all around the world. And we found that 19 of those, this plot is showing the influence of warming on how much catch can be sustainably produced from those populations. So negative numbers represent negative impacts, and positive numbers represent positive impacts where warming actually increases the amount of catch that can be produced. But we found that there were more negative influences than positive influences. And not only that, those negative influences were on fisheries, particularly large fisheries that are especially important to producing food. And so we were able to reconstruct how historical warming has changed the amount of fish that can be sustainably caught in the ocean every year. And we found a 4% decline from 1930 to 2010. And 4% might not sound like a lot, but this is at the global level, and those patterns of climate change impacts really varied among regions. So we saw regions in Europe were particularly negatively impacted by historical warming. Regions in sort of East Asia, also particularly negatively impacted. And then you know, sort of more neutral impacts in a lot of other places. So real sort of heterogeneity in these impacts. There was a really sort of insightful finding that came out of this that I think gives me a lot of hope. We found that the populations that were most negatively impacted by ocean warming tended to be those that have experienced the most overfishing. So this suggests that improving fisheries management, rebuilding overfished stocks, ending overfishing will in itself go a long way towards helping to build climate resilience. But basically in this plot, these deep reds represent populations that were really negatively impacted by climate change. And they are in this quadrant representing the ones that have experienced the highest fishing pressure in the past and also the most rapid warming. But these populations that have experienced lower fishing pressure and more sustainable fishing pressure tended to have more sort of neutral impacts of climate change. So now I want to go into sort of part two of the talk, where we look at what the projected impacts of future climate change are on ocean fisheries and what human society might be able to do to mitigate those impacts. So there is a really great paper that came out a couple of years ago that looked across all of these independent efforts by scientists from around the world to understand how fish biomass is likely to change in the ocean under climate change, and ensembled all of those together. So basically like just sort of like average them all to generate our best understanding of the likely sort of impacts of future climate change on fisheries. So here we see change in biomass relative to, it looks like probably about like 2005 or so, under different climate scenarios. And under that business as usual scenario, we see a global reduction of 17% of fish biomass in the ocean. With more aggressive emissions reductions, we still see a decline, but it's a much smaller decline. So a 5% reduction in fish biomass. So this is something that you know, we're going to have to contend with, and curbing emissions is so critically important because of the vast difference in these two results. And they also show again that there are these patterns of winners and losers in which countries and their waters are likely to experience losses in fisheries availability or increases in fisheries availability. And we see generally, as you know, fish shift poleward to track their preferred temperatures, we see increases in biomass towards the poles and decreases in the equator, where, you know, there are no fisheries that can tolerate really hot water to move into those places. And those sort of inequities get exacerbated under, you know, more extreme emissions scenarios. But here's the good news. This is focused exclusively on shifts in the biomass of fisheries, but fisheries management reforms could really help to reduce the negative impacts associated with these. And this is kind of funny because basically the very first thing that we could do is this plot is showing the proportion of fish populations from around the world that the United Nations estimates to be overfished in orange, or sustainably fished right here, or actually underfished down here. And right now, about 30% of global fisheries are overfished. And this is not a good thing, but it presents an opportunity. It means that those fisheries are producing less catch than they would be able to if they were more sustainably fished. So that presents this opportunity to actually increase catch into the future by ending overfishing. And if that impact is larger than, say, the negative impact from climate change, you could actually see increases in catch by 2100 by implementing better fishing practices. And the other thing that we have to do is really sort of promote international cooperation that coordinates that sustainable management as fish populations shift from one country into another. So this animation is illustrating that sort of process for the Peruvian anchoveta, which is the largest fishery in the world, the most metric tons of fish caught every year. And this population is projected to shift south, shift towards the poles from Peru into Chile. And without really good international cooperation, what's to stop Peru from just overfishing this resource before it exits its waters and it loses access to it? And also, on the other hand, Chile needs information from Peru about this change to be able to prepare for shifting productivity. So we put together this model to sort of look at the potential benefits of both of these actions, of reforming fisheries management to end overfishing and making sure it's done in a coordinated way across nations. And we found that we could actually increase seafood production into 2100 relative to today if we both act to curb emissions, but also implement these best practices in fisheries. So what this plot is showing, on the y-axis, we've got seafood production, and this is right here is our version of today, right here. And the dotted lines represent sort of a business as usual fisheries management. And you see that in all of these scenarios, production from capture fisheries goes down. But in a scenario where you have climate adaptive fisheries management, production from those fisheries actually goes up relative to today under all but the most severe emissions scenario. So this is a sort of source of hope that we could actually produce more food from the ocean sustainably in 2100 compared to today, despite climate change. But a major challenge is, even if we produce the same amount of food from the ocean, the human population is growing. And so the per capita production of food, so the amount of seafood available per person per year, is actually going down over that time span. So if it's a policy goal to try to maintain or increase the amount of seafood available to every person on the planet through the end of the century, we're going to have to sort of supplement these fisheries management reforms with the expansion of sustainable aquaculture. Oh, and this was just to highlight that even with these like really sophisticated reforms in fisheries management, we're not going to be able to offset some of the negative impacts that happen in the developing tropics. And that's even sort of more reason why we have to sort of act to curb emissions, and also to expand aquaculture, especially in these regions, to help maintain food security. Advancing slowly. Okay, so in order to sort of offset these losses to capture fisheries, One option is to look to the expansion of sustainable aquaculture to help produce more food from the ocean. And sort of generally speaking, there are two types of aquaculture that occur in the ocean that are really fundamentally different from each other. One is bivalve aquaculture, so the aquaculture, like the farming of mussels and oysters and clams, and these are often occur on lines as you see depicted here, or in like sort of baskets that are floating on the surface of the water, and they don't require any feed. They're just sort of filter feeding from the water around them, and because of this, they're sort of generally sort of good for the environment, actually providing an ecosystem service of improving water clarity. Finfish aquaculture is different. It's conducted in like pens or nets out in the ocean, and it requires you have to feed these fish to farm them, and a lot of that feed includes wild capture fish. So the industry has been working really hard to reduce the amount of fish that goes into the fish feed, so that you're actually getting, more units of fish out than you're putting in. And finfish aquaculture has, generally sort of more negative impacts on the environment through, like sort of disease risk and eutrophication risk, but that in highly regulated settings can be sort of a acceptable risk given given policy goals. So there's large opportunities for growth in mariculture. So this is showing how many million tons of fish have been produced since 1950 around the world, and you see the orange and red is capture fisheries, and capture fisheries production has plateaued since the sort of 90s. Meanwhile, growth in the production of farmed fish has really grown rapidly. And we've seen the sort of number of countries producing finfish and bivalve aquaculture, which I'm calling mariculture here because it's in the marine environment. And we've seen the number of cultured species increasing, which is really important for climate change adaptation, because we'll have to produce sort of more warm water tolerant species as the ocean warms. And really critically, we've seen dramatic declines in the what's called the fish in, fish out ratio. So how much fish do you have to feed? How much wild fish do you have to feed the farmed fish? And values above 1 are not efficient. It's requiring more wild fish to produce that farmed fish than that farmed fish is by its own. But values below 1 are efficient, and we've seen those fish in, fish out ratios decreasing. So we wanted to understand what's the impact of climate change going to be on the growth potential for marine aquaculture, and can that be done in a sustainable way that actually sort of maintains global seafood production per capita, so available to every person on the planet. And so we did this in a series of steps. The first step was to define sustainable production, to make sure that we weren't modeling, the type of aquaculture that would be really bad for local ecosystems, but that we're actually modeling aquaculture that's consistent with best practices, that has sort of minimal impacts on the ocean ecosystems that we all enjoy. So based on best practices in Europe and the US, we came up with this farm design where within sort of 1 square kilometer of ocean, you might have 24 finfish farms, and then a bivalve farm of this sort of design. So this was our definition of a sustainable farm. And we figured out for 200 different species that are farmed around the world, how long they would need to be sort of cared for, and how large they are when they are harvested, to keep track of how much product they can produce. Then we needed to know about the environmental sort of tolerance of each one of these species. So this plot is illustrating the environmental tolerance for each of the species that we looked at in terms of the range of temperatures it can tolerate and the range of salinities that it can tolerate. And once we've figured that out, then we could look at what like grid cells in the ocean will be suitable for each one of these species into the future, given sort of projections of how the ocean is likely to change under climate change. So for the fish, we considered environmental suitability in terms of temperature and dissolved oxygen and salinity. And then for the bivalves, which rely on phytoplankton, so that's this primary productivity component for feeding, and also are shell forming and therefore sensitive to ocean acidification. We looked at this metric of ocean acidification, and so we were able to identify every cell in the ocean that in every year that could feasibly be suitable for aquaculture. But environmental suitability is not enough. It needs to also be economically feasible. So for each one of these cells in the ocean, we were also able to calculate how much sort of fuel cost it would require to service farms in those areas, how much labor cost it would require for the personnel associated with those areas, how much do the fingerlings, the juveniles that you get used to produce aquaculture cost, all of these capital and operating costs, and identify areas that would actually be profitable to conduct aquaculture in. And then finally, for the finfish, they're sort of limited by how much feed is available from wild fisheries. So we use the results of our wild fisheries modeling to help constrain finfish aquaculture based on how much feed ingredients could be harvested from the ocean. And this plot is just basically showing that in that scenario with climate adaptive fisheries reforms, you get more feed available to support finfish aquaculture than in a scenario with business as usual fisheries management. So we were able to put this all together to see what the likely impacts of climate change would be on the potential for ocean aquaculture and what that means for people. So this is showing, this plot right here is showing seafood production per capita historically, where you see it's generally been going down as the population has grown and capture production has remained about the same. And you see a growing contribution of finfish aquaculture and bivalve aquaculture. And when we project out to mid-century and the end of the century, under increasingly severe climate change scenarios, with sort of like business as usual practices in fisheries and aquaculture farming, we see that we're unable to maintain today's sort of production of seafood per person in either of these time points, and it becomes progressively harder under increasingly severe climate change. But if we enacted these sort of climate adaptive fisheries reforms that sort of optimally managed wild fisheries and also enabled sort of best practices in sustainable aquaculture, we could see increased production per capita by mid-century and end of the century, under all but the most severe climate scenario. So that's the good news. That's the good news part of the talk. And this would be, this is ambitious. This would require like really sort of targeted investments in fisheries reforms and aquaculture expansion. But that's the sort of investments that we're hoping to motivate with this paper. And the other piece of good news is that that was presented on a global scale, and through trade, that means every country could see expanded seafood availability for their populations. But many countries have, sort of policy goals of having being independent from other countries in their sort of domestic production of seafood. And under those reform scenarios, we do see fairly high ability for countries to increase production per capita on their own. And really importantly, because this relies so heavily on expansions in mariculture, we wanted to look at how much of the ocean would have to get developed to achieve this. And very fortunately, the answer is very small proportions of the ocean would actually have to get developed for ocean aquaculture to achieve these benefits. So this plot is showing the proportion of the exclusive economic zones of every country that would have to get that would get developed under a bunch of different scenarios. And this is shown on a log scale because so many of the majority of those countries, it's 1 to 2% of their sort of ocean area that would have to get developed to achieve these benefits. So I'm coming to the end of the talk, but I did want to highlight that there are scientists out there that sort of see this these sort of findings and these sort of perspectives as like being very sort of futurist and unlikely. And I just think that those sort of criticisms are really sort of myopic, given the scale of the challenge that climate change is going to pose towards feeding the sort of global human population. So this is a really nice figure from a great paper that shows that the negative impacts of climate change on terrestrial and ocean-based like food systems are really highly correlated. So these like more blue colors show countries where fisheries are really sensitive to climate change, but agriculture is less sensitive. Yellows shows countries where agriculture is more sensitive to climate change, but fisheries aren't that sensitive. And these purplish colors, which you just see across the developing tropics, are places where both agricultural and fisheries production systems are expected to be really hit by climate change. So it's going to require really big, really coordinated sort of action to really help these countries out. So it's those sort of actions that we're hoping to help motivate. So I just wanted to conclude by sort of summarizing what we've talked about here. So I hope I've sort of convinced you that climate change will reduce the catch potential of global fisheries, that more poleward countries are going to see increases in catch potential as fish shift their distributions to follow cooler waters, while equatorward countries will see declines. We've seen that reforming fisheries management to be climate adaptive could reduce the impact of climate change, but that will be insufficient on its own to maintain catch in all countries or to maintain per capita seafood production. So if that's a policy goal, we're going to have to look to the expansion of sustainable mariculture to offset those losses, and that any of these reforms are going to become less effective, more difficult to implement, and result in less equitable outcomes without curbing emissions. So thanks so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Mary, you had some questions. Are you there, Mary?
I'm here, but the internet is.
Oh, your internet is.
That you read them.
Okay, I'll read them. Mary's first question was, do you have any idea what percentage of the world's population depends almost solely on fish as a source of protein?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the one of the statistics that gets thrown around a lot is that a third of the global population depends on fish for more than 20% of its source of protein. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but it is a very important source of protein, and it varies by countries. So countries like in like Pacific Island states, fish is over 80% of their sources of protein. So it's big, and we have another paper that I didn't get to present today that I really like, that sort of shows that increasing seafood, the production of seafood, would have really dramatic human health benefits as well, because it's such a healthy alternative to red meat, and you actually see really significant decreases in micronutrient deficiencies and the sort of burden of disease associated with that from increasing fish production the way we see here. Basically, producing more fish would result in lower prices for fish, which would result in sort of consumer switching to more fish consumption.
Okay, thanks. Mary had another question, and that was, what do you think the cost of progressive reforms will be? How many countries for which fish is an important product can be expected to pay for these reforms?
That's a really great question too. So the US, Australia, New Zealand, Iceland, those are all countries that are huge leaders in really effective fisheries management, and it's very expensive. It requires a lot to fund these scientific surveys, to go out and monitor fish populations, to pay scientists to analyze that data, to support the managers that engage fishermen in sort of being co-involved in making management decisions. So it's expensive, but the good news is that in places where that expense is not likely to be invested in quickly, there are alternative ways of achieving good fisheries governance. So one system is by awarding a community of people in the same area like a sort of sole management responsibility over the resources in that area. It really incentivizes good stewardship, because once they own like basically once it's the continued existence of that resource is tied to their livelihoods and their children's livelihoods, it really incentivizes good stewardship. So I guess my answer, it's expensive, but there are less expensive options available that can be effective as well in context dependent places.
Thanks. Craig Prater, you had a question.
Hi, Chris. I really enjoyed your talk. My question was, what's behind the reduction in that FIFO ratio? And then, I'm trying to even get my head around how is it possible that it's less than 1? When I think about, other predators, they presumably eat, much more than their body weight per year. So how do we get less than 1, and what's driving it down?
It is amazing. Yeah. So the more the more sort of omnivorous a fish is, the easier it is to get it less than one. So like the fish that are like really piscivorous, I think they have a bigger challenge getting the feed to not just be fish. But the way they do this is there's a lot of like soy and corn in the feed, and then there's a lot of like synthesized laboratory sort of products that provide the nutrition that the fish would normally provide. One thing that happens from like getting that ratio below 1 is that it increases demands on agricultural production, because now some more soy has to go to the aqua feed than fish going to the aqua feed. But people have shown that because fish sort of turn food into edible proteins so much more efficiently than cows or pigs or chickens, that's actually like a very efficient use of agricultural land. And I think the drivers of this have been a mixture of social and costs. So I think back in like the 90s, early 2000s, when they were really high, I think the aquaculture industry just had a bad reputation because it was such a clearly like inefficient way to produce food. So I think there was a lot of social pressure to get that down, and then I think it ultimately became more affordable to not rely on capture fisheries.
Thanks.
Hey, Cliff Warren, you had a couple of questions. Did you want to ask those? Or I can ask them for you if you like. Cliff asked, what about the nutrient content of wild versus farmed fish?
So there is a difference, and I wish I knew more about the difference, but because the wild fish, because the farmed fish are being fed something that is not equivalent to the wild fish, wild prey, there is a difference in the nutritional contribution for people, and I can't remember. I wish I could remember which direction it fell. If they actually become more nutritious because of the feed that they're getting, or less nutritious. So I'll have to look that up and get back to you.
Okay, and then Cliff also asked, are fishermen able to switch from fishing in the sea to running farms, as far as their career jobs?
Yeah, that's a good question. That does happen. It has not sort of happened on large scales because it's such different skill sets, but there are programs now that are trying to sort of help sort of ease those transitions, because there is recognition that part of adapting to climate change is going to require like transformation of livelihoods. But this is challenging for people to stomach for really understandable reasons. I mean, if you've been fishing for your whole life and your family before that, it's really hard to switch away from fishing.
Bob Kavas, you had a question?
Yes, I was wondering if the fish farms and mariculture can be ramped up in the coastal areas without creating a lot of coastal pollution on beaches and near shore areas.
That's a great question, and a really sort of important component of this expansion, because we want this to be done in a way that affects like other industries and other sort of values for the ocean minimally. And on the most sort of sophisticated end, there's big calls for it's called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, where basically at a finfish farm, you would also be farming sort of in the same area, kelp and mussels that would be helping to sort of clean up clean up the mess that the fish are creating. And then besides that, there's just like a lot of technological ways for reducing but not eliminating the pollution associated with finfish farms. So hopefully we see more of that integrated multi-trophic aquaculture in these expansions.
Great. Dennis, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, I was wondering if, because I talked to a fisherman this morning who said he wasn't going out to get the fish he usually goes after because he couldn't afford the extra fuel to go out. So I'm wondering if fuel costs become an increasingly critical factor, how do you see that factor affecting these remedial equations that you're describing?
Totally, that's really interesting. So we were also concerned about this, and in our efforts, we included sensitivity analyses where we said, you know, we think we've created the best estimate of costs to our ability, but what if we've underestimated those costs and they're actually going to be 2 times greater than what we've predicted? And a lot of the this was only on the aquaculture side, which is different because they're not traveling quite as far. And we found the results were still robust to that. But I think you're right. If fuel, it's interesting. If fuel costs go up, then we would probably see we would see less capture production because people are fishing less, but that might also allow populations to recover, which increases the abundance of the resource, which means that the remaining fishers are able to catch it more efficiently. So it's kind of complicated, but definitely a good point to consider.
Charu, you had a question?
Yeah, so you know, at least in the past I've heard that you have to be worried about heavy metals in fish and not limit your consumption of certain kinds of fish because of that issue. So how does this play into all this? How can we assure that these food sources are going to be safe for our health?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So it accumulates those heavy metals like, you know, mercury accumulate in the fish at the top of the food chain the most, like in tuna. So I think part of it is, you know, limiting tuna consumption and maybe eating sort of other fish sort of lower on the food chain. But that's a great question. I ask this question all the time, so I need to look into it better. But if that 7.5 kilograms of fish protein per year that we calculate, what the risk of the heavy metals is, and I think it's low, but I need to look that up. Thanks for that question.
Dennis, you had another question?
Yes, this derives from something someone else asked earlier about fishermen being able to switch from fishing to running farms, and that reminded me that the whole concept of land sovereignty and ownership in farms, on land farms, is because a farmer needs to be in the same place every year and not have to plow new ground and so forth and so on. So how do you see, have you considered the impact of increased mariculture on how people view do they have the same need for sovereignty over the water in which they farm?
Totally. I think that's a really apt analogy, and I think it will require that, and it doesn't necessarily have to be strict ownership, but it could just be like lease zones. So I think a lot of work will be in designing how like the government sort of leases areas to aquaculture farmers so that they can shift in space through time as conditions change. Because if they stay in the same place, that means ultimately they'll have to probably farm a new species. So I think there'll be a lot of sort of like interesting legal work there to figure out how to have like lease areas that can move.
Tom, you had a question.
Hi, Chris. Great presentation. There's a local our harbor manager or former harbor manager, Mick Cromman, wrote a book about the history of Santa Barbara fishing. It's very fascinating, but there are a couple of takeaways that might be applied here. It was interesting to me how one fishery would be a great productive catch for a few years, and then the fishing would switch to something else, and then would switch to something else. Like sardines were once popular, and along those lines, he had an excellent discussion of the lobster industry and how they used to catch them by hand. And somebody invented a trap. Somebody made traps out of wood, which expanded the market. Somebody made traps out of metal, that expanded the market. And then somebody put a hydraulic lift on the boat, so now you can pick up the lift without having a crew of 3 or 4 people. They have a lot more traps. And then now you have GPS and sonar and all kinds of stuff like that. I'm just wondering if you've included the effects of technology, I don't know how you do that, in some of these predictions on future catches.
That's really interesting. I haven't read that book. I'm going to have to go and find that.
It's at the Maritime Museum. I'm sure they have copies there.
Totally.
So fascinating.
So I think part of the good news in the US context is that so many of our fisheries are managed using a catch limit, where we basically every year we say how much the fishery is allowed to go and catch. And so technological advancements don't in fisheries managed that way, technological advancements don't pose a risk to sustainability. They just increase profits for fishermen. Because they're able to go and catch they're awarded more efficiently. But in fisheries where we don't have that type of management, where instead we just limit the number of permits to the fishery, we limit the number of hours the vessel can spend fishing, changes in catch efficiency and the adoption of technology can risk overfishing more. So that's where it requires a careful consideration. But also there are other ways that new technology could be really good. So I didn't get to talk about my Dungeness crab work, but the Dungeness crab fishery is the most lucrative fishery on the West Coast, and it's historically been the easiest to manage. The fishermen go out and they catch 90% of the male crabs every year, and it rebounds to be perfectly fine the next year. But in recent years, there have been sort of increasing entanglements of whales in the Dungeness crab fishing gear that are sort of really sort of threatening the stability of this fishery. And one clear way to solve this is to have some sort of ropeless gear technology where traps can be deployed and recovered without having a buoy that goes from the trap to the surface to entangle the whale. And we're a ways off from having that type of technology, at least having it be economically viable for the fishermen. But being able to do that would solve a really sort of pressing conservation problem, and a sort of problem that sort of threatens the viability of this fishery.
Robert, you have your hand raised.
Oh, yeah, thank you for wonderful talk. I'd seen an article in Scientific American many years ago that talked about doing mariculture further offshore to reduce the impacts of coastal pollution. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I think that would really work. It's just more expensive, but that might be the way that sort of to Dennis's question earlier, that might be a way that governments think about starting to lease these areas, is to is to do, when they're doing their sort of spatial planning about how they want to see the ocean used, to just locate those lease areas offshore, and then the people that you know, put in bids to get those, they have to, you know, go home and do the economics to make sure it's worthwhile to go all the way out there. But I think that's definitely a viable way of reducing the impacts of nearshore aquaculture.
Are there other questions? You can just unmute yourself and speak up if you do. Okay, well, it was a great talk. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks so much. Thanks
Appreciate
for all
it.
your engagement.
Yeah.
Those were really great questions. Some things I need to go and look up now too. Yeah.
Okay, we appreciate it and hope to see people on March 30th for the Science Fair awards, and then again in April for our next regular meeting. Thank you.